Let me start with a confession that probably none of you can relate to. The amount of times in the last 3-4 years that I have sat down with my journal and I have mapped out how I'm going to be much more intentional with my life. And I'm going to spend my time and my resources and my emotional energy and my relational energy on the things and the people that really matter to me, including God. And then I don't ultimately follow through on it. The amount of times I've done that is absurd. It's very difficult to be as intentional as you want in life. You know, you make it a little bit of the way, but you don't quite follow through. One of the things I'm really excited, Mike, to have you talk to us about is, and I know you're going to say you don't do this perfectly either, but you and Bethany have really carved out a very intentional life, and your approach to life with your family, with your children, with your career, with the Lord, and how you structure your time, all of that, I think, is going to be really challenging and encouraging for all of us because you're not a time management guru, you're not a theologian, you're a successful person, you're a smart person, but you're a normal person, and you found this way to have a very intentional life. So I want to get into that, but why don't you flesh out a little bit more on what Jeremy said about kind of who you are, your faith story, your career story. How do we get to this point today? And then we're going to jump in on some questions about intentionality.
Yeah, I do. We are multi-minivan owners, and it's funny. We only have 3 kids, so everybody that sees 2 minivans in our parking lot thinks we're like the Duggars or something, and they're like, well, I mean, what do you have, like 12 kids? And we're like, no, just 3. Just 3. We just like minivans that much. So it's always a funny notion about us. But just something about me, you know, personally, I was born into a Christian home, great godly Christian home. I had 2 wonderful parents. I consider that winning the lottery. I would choose my childhood over winning the lottery every day. And one of the things that I've noticed is that so many people struggle with the idea of a benevolent, gracious Heavenly Father because they don't have an earthly father that had those attributes. And that was certainly not the case for me. I had 2 parents that just consistently poured the love of Christ into me. Thankfully, they're still alive. Just 2 of the wisest people that I've ever met in my life. That said, my faith was theirs, right? I believed as a child. I believed because they taught it to me. I believed because it was what they believed. Mm-hmm. So my faith journey is one of that faith becoming my own. And I would say that the real impetus for that faith becoming my own was the 2008-2009 financial crisis. I was in corporate finance with a large corporation. I'd done well. I had been moving up the corporate ladder. I was very proud of that. That was my identity. Mm-hmm. My identity was certainly in that. I was in my late 20s. And so the financial crisis hit, and my department was wiped out. I was now without a job. And that identity was completely gone. And so I had a lot of time to kind of sit around and think about, wow, now what? You know, you're late 20s. Who are you? And I always say that, you know, I was in a very uncomfortable spot. And I always say that you'll never experience the greatness, the fullness of God's faithfulness until you're uncomfortable. And whether that is you taking a step of faith and making yourself uncomfortable, or whether that's God using scenarios to put you in a space of being uncomfortable, that's when you really experience the fullness of God's faithfulness. That's where you go from knowing God's promises to believing them. And in those months and years, I saw God closing doors, opening some doors, but it just became very apparent to me that He was orchestrating every detail in my life that I'd never thought about. You know, things had, you know, in your 20s, things seldom go wrong. But in those months and that year, He was just orchestrating every detail of my life. And it was almost like, gosh, go figure. Maybe His plan's better than mine. And that thought, as silly as that sounded, thought had probably never entered my mind. But I got to see it firsthand. But I was very, very uncomfortable. And since that time, in the last 15 years or so, I've built a real estate investment firm. I bought and sold an e-commerce company, and then I started a small business consulting group.
All right, that's great. Let's dive into 2009, 2008. Okay, so you're in your late 20s, you're married,
Yes.
but no children.
Correct.
Okay, so married, no children, on an upward trajectory career-wise, upward trajectory with your finances, all goes away. And you said two really interesting things. You said 10 interesting things, but two that I want to get into. One was I had this relationship with God that essentially was just modeled on my parents' relationship, and that was a time when it became real. And then you talked about God orchestrating a lot of the details in a way that showed you that how much he cared about you and that his way was better than yours. So let's do those backwards. What ultimately happened with your career? How did you know that God was caring about you? Can you give us some examples of what that looked like, and how did he get you onto the path that you're on now, both spiritually but also professionally? That was like 5 questions. I can break it down. Yeah.
I would say they were intertwined. Just to give you some examples, I have the personality, I don't wait real well. And so when there are multiple doors, some people will say, well, I'm just going to wait for God to open one of those doors. And I have the personality that says, no, I'm going to make progress towards going through all those doors, but I am going to pray that God will slam shut the doors that he does not want me to go through. And so, I had just the randomest things. I was trying to stay in the world of finance, which in that time, really nobody was hiring, but I had some connections too. And I got offered a job, and then the next day, the company put on a 90-day hiring freeze and couldn't hire anybody. And it's like, oh, what a coincidence. But I'd been praying for God to close that door if it was not his will. Well, he did. He did. I mean, that's just too much of a coincidence. I had gone for another interview that was up in Boston, and they had told me going into the interview that I was a shoo-in. I had done preliminary interviews, and this was just a formality. And I thought the interview went really well, and they had a change of heart. And so I had prayed for God to open and close doors. So when you get that news, at first you have that sense of disappointment for about 60 seconds, and then you're like, you know what? But I prayed, God, like, if you don't want me to do this, I want you to close the door, which he did. So now what am I going to be disappointed? And there were several examples like that. I had been dabbling in real estate. I never thought that it was a full-time possibility, but God closed these other doors, and he opened the real estate door for me. And, I can just look back on it, and it's just unbelievable to look back at my disbelief. But he showed me things. He moved me where he wanted me professionally, but he did that through challenging my faith. So he put me exactly where, and I think that I'm so thankful for that, because he plucked me out of a place where I probably would have just kept moving up, and where I would have kept putting my identity in my accomplishments and successes. And my identity is as a child of Christ. And so I'm thankful that he did that he plucked me out of that.
Well, and so now you can look back with a lot of clarity, but you were just saying that sometimes you look back and you say, man, I didn't really trust the Lord. What was that experience like? Did you have moments of real doubt? Or did you doubt? I mean, there are a couple of different ways that we doubt when things are hard. One is God real? One is, does God care about me? Is it something about me? And three, we start going, well, maybe God is real. Maybe God does care about me, but I'm doing everything wrong. So is God real? Do I matter? Am I doing this wrong? Were all three of those kind of part of your wrestling? What was that like? Were you and your wife talking that through, praying together, crying together? Or were you just kind of, you talk about, I'm moving forward, I'm going through the doors. Were you kind of able to be relentlessly forward moving? But it sounds like you did have some struggles and doubts during that time.
Yeah, I mean, are these all going to be multiple choice?
I'll make it simpler. I'm sorry.
4-part questions. And you start writing
If
down.
you have two minivans, you're like driving and giving snacks to the back at the same time. You can
I
do
text
it.
and drive.
Yeah.
I do. I'm not going to lie. So only when I have all three kids
There's
in the
so
car
much
with
grace in this room. It's just,
Yeah,
it's really good.
Come on. No, I've forgotten the questions, but no, I'm kidding. That was 15 years ago, and
Yeah.
my faith journey has come a long way. So those were very, very much times of distress, times of a lot of pressure. Those were definitely valleys in my life. No question, those were valleys. But one of the things that I pray for every day is those valleys. That in those times I was very distressed. Today, when those valleys come, I'm not as distressed because I had the growth in those times. And the things two things that you need to know about the valleys, that I've learned about the valleys, is one, they will come. James does not say if trials come. It says when trials come. So they are coming. Your mentality in them and your mindset towards them is what's going to affect your outlook on that. The other thing that you need to understand is no one was meant for a mountaintop life. Okay? So if you think about your faith is like a muscle. It's a perfect example. Your faith is like a muscle. If I want a larger bicep, wanting a larger bicep is not going to give me a larger bicep. It has to be worked out. It has to be sore. It has to be uncomfortable. And your faith is 100% the same. You have got to be uncomfortable, and it has to be worked out. And the place that's done is the valleys. And so no one would, we know where the valleys where perseverance is developed. And we know, like God's promises, we know that valleys are good for us, but none of us would raise our hand and say, yeah, I'll take a valley this week. But it's important to recognize the importance of valleys because they are what develops that muscle, that what develops that faith, so that we don't go through life as infant Christians.
That could be the end. That was pretty good. I also just now have learned why I'm not gaining any muscle all these years. So I didn't realize it. So let's get to now, and let's talk about intentionality, right? So one of the ways that we can have perspective during the valleys, but not intend to live on the mountains, is if we have a sense of I'm gonna form and structure my life in such a way that it's moving the direction that I want with the priorities I want. And life circumstances and job circumstances can make that more or less doable. But once you talk about how you all try to be intentional with your time, with your resources, with your family.
Yeah, I'm gonna read you a quote from the spiritual sage, the Dalai Lama. About 10 or 15 years ago, I came across this quote, and it just changed the way I was thinking. I was in the rat race, and it just changed the way I think. And so I'm going to read this to you. And it's the Dalai Lama, when asked what surprised him most about humanity, he said, man, because he sacrifices his health in order to make money. Then he sacrifices his money to recuperate his health. Then he's so anxious about the future that he does not enjoy the present. The result being that he doesn't live in the present or the future. He lives as if he's never going to die, and then dies having never really lived. And a simpler way of saying that is to all of you is, listen, every one of you was made for more than to work, pay bills, and die. Okay? I love this quote from the Dalai Lama. It's great for Christians, non-Christians alike. But this has to have a spiritual application. And here's the spiritual application of that. If my hands represent the spectrum of eternity, This is the spectrum of eternity, okay? Your lives, my lives. You're 80 or 110 years on this earth, you could not see it through a microscope. Couldn't see it through a microscope. And that's just a fact. And that needs to affect you. That fact needs to affect you. It needs to affect how you live on a daily basis. It needs to affect where your priorities are. And most importantly, it needs to affect where your hope lies. So that's started with the Dalai Lama, but then come down to the spiritual side. We have such a short time on this earth. When you think about eternity, this is, blink of an eye. How are you going to spend that time on this earth?
And how do we think through those things? We have technology gobbling up our time, trying to grab our attention. We have jobs that, in some good and healthy ways, are taking up our time. But sometimes some workplaces are trying to grab for more time, more attention. There's 15 church committees you could serve on. Organizations like Needle's Eye might ask you to volunteer. There's all these good things that you could do. You need to take care of yourself. You need to sleep. You need to eat. You need to spend time with friends. How can we be, what is it? Knowing what you just said and living in light of it are two different things. So give us some practical examples of what that's looked like for you and Bethany and your family.
Yeah, I think the first thing is and this is a comment that you've made, is busyness, productivity. Not the same thing. Yep. But we confuse them as the same, right? Being busy feels productive, but being busy, that whole notion that being busy is productive, that is the enemy of the seasons of rest that God grants you in your life. I've always had my trajectory has always been a very not steep trajectory. It's always been kind of like this. I was never willing to sacrifice certain things. I'm not going to miss my kids' field trips. I'm not going to miss their soccer games. I'm going to be there to tuck them in bed every night. Things that were non-negotiables for my wife and I. And so that was our trajectory. And I have lots of friends, tons of friends that have this trajectory. Made their first $1 million before they were 30. I read about them in Richmond Biz Sense every day, and they're the big deals, and my desire has always been a little bit to be more anonymous in the shadows. But I have lots of friends. I read about them, and sure, you can get envious of that sometimes. Like, oh man, he just built a 200 house development or built this medical building and sold it to VCU, and I know what he paid for that, and I see what he sold for it. My goodness, that guy never has to work another day of his life. But I also know the collateral damage that was there with a trajectory like this, personally, because I know a lot of these people personally, and so many of them, there's estranged kids, there's divorces, there's really, really messy lives. And that was something that I was just never willing to be a part of the equation. And what I always tell people is God cares about the sparrow that falls from the sky. And I love that it's not eagle or some super majestic bird. It's a sparrow. Okay, in those times, the sparrow was the most insignificant living thing in the world. You could buy 2 of them for the smallest denomination of Roman coin. So essentially a penny could buy you 2 sparrows. I mean, these things were worthless, yet God cared about them. And when you have that context, you know what? God cares about every single detail of your life. God cares that my trajectory is this. He doesn't want me to have this trajectory because he knows that I don't want my kids when they're 18 to leave home and never be a part of our family. So understanding the God's obsession, for lack of a better word, his reckless love. I was just listening to the reckless love. Nothing about God is reckless, right? That sounds crazy to say, but his love is reckless. It's one-sided. It is relentless towards us. And so understanding the nature of God and understand that he cares about every single little detail because he cares about an insignificant sparrow that falls to the ground.
Yeah, that's great. Now that I have my own family and I think about, you start to think about your own childhood differently when you become an adult. I'm sure we've all had that experience. And I find that the things that resonate the most to me about my parents are things like my dad being at every game, sometimes coaching, my parents weighing job decisions and possible upward mobility against what it would mean for family time, coming downstairs every morning and seeing that my dad had a quiet time or was still doing. I mean, those are the things that actually have lasted for me versus did we have as extravagant a vacation as somebody else, or was our house as big as somebody else? We had a minivan. It was a pretty good life.
Nice.
One of the ways that you are intentional now that we've talked about, that you and I have talked about prior to tonight, is you're intentional about pouring into other people, but in the context of career. So investing in younger men, younger Christian kind of businessmen. And you talk about, you got to have a Paul and a Barnabas and a Timothy. So and maybe in personal life, but I know you do that with work. So kind of explain that concept for people who may not be familiar. And then what does that look like for you?
Yeah. So there's Timothy, there's Barnabas, and there's Paul. And for those of you who are not familiar with this model, the Timothys in your life are the people who are younger believers than you. Perhaps you would be a mentor to them, typically younger in age, but certainly younger in the maturity of their faith. The Barnabases are your peers. So for me, that's my CPG group.
Will you explain what that is if people don't know that?
Christian Presidents Group. So people that are in the same chapter of my life, typically the same age, kids in the same age, similar career paths, things like that.
Yeah, outreach of Needle's Eye, part of the groups that we do.
Oh, yeah. See, Christian Presidents Group, yeah.
That wasn't a plug. I just want people to know what you're talking about. Sorry.
Yeah.
So that's your Barnabases. Yeah, these guys
Barnabas.
here. Yeah.
And then the Pauls are kind of the mentors in your life. These are folks who have been through the chapter that you are in. They're through the chapter that you're going into. They're typically older than you. I have 4 Pauls. I would say my father is probably my first and foremost. I have an Enneagram coach who was my youth pastor in high school, which we meet with every 2 weeks. My Uncle Don, who's an interesting story. Maybe I'll share a little bit more about him later. And then Bob DeLille, who's here. And Bob was in my first CPG group and is probably 20 years older than me. And again, people that you can turn to when you can't see the forest through the trees, or there's moments of distress, and they've been through the chapter of your life in every regard, family, professionally, spiritually. They know, they've been there. So you can turn to those folks. Why I cultivate Timothys, which are the people that are younger than you that you mentor, the reason you cultivate Timothys are for the same reason that you share the gospel with those who don't know it. And that's because no one in the history of the world, no one in this room has ever been chosen to merely be a recipient of God's grace. None of us are chosen to merely be recipients of that. It's our privilege and our responsibility to share that. Part of that is pouring into younger Christians to bring them up in their faith. Part of that is sharing with non-believers. And I think the great model for this, when you look at the early church, imagine the early church, after Christ's resurrection was 120 people. Imagine if they had been content to merely be recipients of God's grace, but instead they were devoted and they went to every corner of the world, the gospel. 120 people. That's smaller than most of our churches. So their commitment to do that is how we should model ours. The Barnabases, as I said, those are kind of my CPG guys. That's who am I currently in community with that is in a similar chapter, that's just very helpful because you're in the same chapter. And then I think the Pauls are for the same reason we read the scripture, right? It's to mature our faith. It's to deepen our faith. Those guys typically have been around longer. They have more experience. They have more wisdom. And you can tap into that to really mature your faith.
So we could talk a lot about loneliness and relationships. The Surgeon General a few years ago said that our country is facing an epidemic of loneliness. It was actually one of the leading causes of death is people lonely and isolated. If we have time, we'll get into that. But the mentor thing, especially as people feel disconnected and they don't have great relationships, my experience has been, I wonder if this is yours, that I have to ask someone to mentor me, which feels weird and uncomfortable and a little presumptuous. Has that been your experience, or do you just have mentors out of the woodwork coming and finding you? And how does that work for you?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a weird discussion both ways because it's also a little presumptuous to be like, hey, how would you like me to mentor you?
Yeah, that's true.
You look like somebody that could use my help. And it's like, what? So like,
Fair
that's
point.
a little awkward. And then when you ask somebody to be your mentor, a lot of times you catch them off guard and they're like, what does that mean? Like, we're going to start wearing friendship bracelets or something? Or, they're like, a lot of people have not been mentors.
Yeah.
And I will also say that they all look different, right? Like some mentors, you call them when you need, when there's something that you need help with. Some that you meet with once a month. So it can be a formal relationship or an informal relationship. I have both with my mentors. Some my father, I talk to him every day.
Sure.
Right? And it's not always deep stuff. But then I have an Enneagram coach we meet with twice a week. And that's gone from Enneagram coaching to, my gosh, like we kind of ran out of Enneagram discussion after a year. But I'm like, my gosh, you have, like, of course, pastor for 40 years. You have so much spiritual knowledge that I need to glean that from you raising my kids, how I am with my wife. How do you study the Bible? How do you prioritize things and just listen? And it's just eye-opening.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So be bold. And it's not terrible if the person is caught off guard, because sometimes that is a mark of humility with a mentor if they don't see themselves that way.
It is, yeah.
So you're very intentional in all these relationships. One other thing that I really appreciate about you is that you're very intentional with stewardship of wealth and resources. And Jeremy talked about this a little bit when he introduced you. Your kind of your approach to your business profit and giving. Talk about how do you try to approach philanthropy? What does that look like for you and your family?
I think our number one rule is that you need to give to organizations that minister to you and your family. So that's kind of where you want the bread and butter, the bulk of your giving. But the second thing, which is I think every bit as important, is there has to be a sacrificial element to your giving. It cannot merely be out of abundance. And isn't it amazing how we don't want to be rigid? We're not rigid. But man, we're rigid when it comes to that 10%. I gave my 10%, so. Well, I don't know. Was there an element of sacrifice to that 10%? I mean, you can make $10 million. You give $1 million. Was that sacrificial at all? Or was that just out of your extreme abundance? And I don't think the Holy Spirit is the one saying, oh, cut it off at 10%. No, that's us. That's us, right? That's where we have to seek the Holy Spirit and how we give. And I think the greatest example of giving is the widow with 2 mites. Right? She gave everything she had, which was 2 mites. I'm pretty sure she gave more than 10%. I mean, have you ever thought about the widow she could have given 1 mite, kept 1. I mean, that's a 50% tithe rate. That's pretty impressive. But no, she gave everything she had. She gave sacrificially. She gave both mites that she had. And it wasn't the amount, it was her heart. So when we give, it's important that our hearts are in it. And sometimes if you're getting ready to push a button of making a contribution, and I have a policy, if there's an ounce of kind of, this is so much money, I don't want to give it, I don't hit the submit button. Hold on. Let your heart get right until you're gratefully giving that money. If there's an ounce of, can't believe I'm giving this much money, hold off, because you don't want to resent that gift. The other example I have in my life is I have one of my Pauls was my Uncle Don, who's this wildly successful philanthropist guy, awesome Christian guy. Built his company and maybe 5 years ago sold it to a Berkshire Hathaway company for just insane amounts of money. And started his company giving away 10% of the profits, living off 90. And by the end, before he sold the company, he was living off 10 and giving away 90. And how did he get to that conclusion, right? Because he recognized that his gifts needed to be of sacrifice. And he let the Holy Spirit determine, no, you can write a check for more than that. You can write a check for more. He abandoned that rigidity that we like to abandon rigidity in our lives, but it feels good to hold that rigidity at 10%. And so I would encourage everybody here to say, are my tithes and offerings, is it requiring any sacrifice at all on my part? And if it's not, it's time to revisit it.
Well, one of the things, when Needle's Eye tries to help people think about this in the context of work, one of the things we talk about is giving away your influence and your expertise to other people, helping others in your industry or in your company, help them grow and kind of give freely of yourself and not be withholding. I know that's something that you care about as well. Do you want to speak to that real quick?
Yeah, I mean, it's the LIFE acronym. You give generously of your labor, which is your employees. You give generously of your influence. You give generously of your finances, and you give generously of your expertise.
Can you say that again one more time? Just for people to wrap their heads around it.
So you give generously to your labor, which are employees, if you have employees. You give generously of your influence, which is the connections you have, You give generously of your finances, which is the F. And then the E is giving generally of your expertise. And, for me, I don't really have employees per se. I try to, giving generously of my finances is I've gotten myself there, I think. But influence is a little bit tricky because influence is the connections you have. Hey, when somebody needs a help, do I call Jordan and say, hey, Jordan, you and me are buddies, and I'm buddy with this guy, and he's a good Christian guy, you're a good Christian guy. How do I make this connection? How do I use my influence to further the kingdom? The last one is expertise, which is one that let's call expertise time, right? I get a lot of people that call me and say, hey, Mike, I know that you do this and this, and you have a flexible lifestyle, something about the Dalai Lama. And I want that. I want to do what you do, man, because it looks like, you're going out and doing yoga every morning and, drive 2 cool minivans and, whatever. And so I get a lot of people that call me and hey, can we grab lunch? And I'm used to be very tight with my time. Like, when you get older, your commodity is no longer money. Your commodity is time.
Yeah.
So when people ask for your time, you're just like, maybe, how about half an hour? Can we do a phone call instead of lunch, type thing. And I'd say over the last 10 years, that expertise is something that I felt God call me on to say, no, like you're a subject matter expert about a topic that a lot of people want to know about. And so be generous with your time. And so I have lots and lots of lunches, and I would make that available to anybody here that has any interest in things I do, as I get a lot of people that call me now, and the first thing out of their mouth is, hey, Mike, I know you're busy. And I'm like, no. Rewind. I'm not too busy for you. I'm not too busy to give you my time. You're worth the time.
Yeah.
You have to be worth the time. You have to be worth me sharing my expertise with you. So I think those are hard. Those are things that as you get older, it's harder to give because it shifts from writing a check is not too bad, but like I get asked to be in BNI groups, and I'm like, wait a second, you guys meet every single Wednesday? Like, what if I don't want to come next Wednesday? Or the Wednesday after that? That sounds terrible. That's like my time. Like, I want to do this and that. And so I think giving your expertise and pouring time into people.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for being generous with your time and your expertise tonight. That was really, really helpful. We'll have time in a few minutes for some Q&A so people can ask you some more questions. But I like you, I respect you, and I appreciate you sharing with us. Let's tell Mike thank you.
Thanks.